So technically we're in summer. It has been raining a lot here, which we are very grateful for. We truly are. Like, we do need the rain. But I'm like, rain at night when I'm sleeping, not during the day when I have to do stuff. I'm like, I feel you're being a bit inconsiderate.
It has been snowing here, so I won't go on a rant about snow because every American has their own opinion about snow depending on where they've lived. But
Mm-hmm.
I have lived all over this country and seen why they all have their opinions on snow. You just have to know, though, like how the different areas have to deal with the snow to understand why they have that mindset.
No, I do find it funny though, because when I was living in Maryland and Virginia, they would literally close the schools. It was like 1 inch of snow. And then you go up to New York and they're like shoulder deep into snow and they're like, no, it's fine. You know what we have managed to do, Sarah? We have managed for this episode to get 3 time zones into one. You are 9 hours behind me and our guest is 9 hours ahead of me. And so I'm sitting here with a coffee today because I was like, it is a crime for me to wake up so early on a Saturday morning.
It is so late on a Friday night here. So this is a brand of tea, but it isn't a tea. It's just their mango flavor because I love mango.
Let's do this. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Tea and Tales. I'm Madeleine I Now.
And I'm Sarah Sampson. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And we especially want to thank Ashley Virginia Rouge and Harriet Garfinkel. Today is a very exciting episode because we ran a competition for a blurb and we have a winner whose blurb will be reviewed by a guest speaker.
But we are more excited to be talking about blurbs today because I know that that is an author's pain in their butt, in their toe. I don't know where, but where it's uncomfortable because we can write 100,000 word novels. We cannot write a 150 word blurb, apparently. That's not in us. We would like to invite and to welcome Jessie Cunniffe.
So for our viewers, when you see that season 2, episode 5, part 2, that is the blurb review, and it is just the blurb review. Well, I'm really excited to have you here, Jessie, because one of the people in one of my writer groups is struggling with her blurb right now. And I was like, I've got the episode for you. It is
amazing.
She sent it through writers groups and she's getting different answers.
Look, one of my favorite things, like aside from the fact that the podcasts go out into the world and help people, is when I hear from like my students or occasionally from like podcast presenters I've talked to that they've helped someone else.
It's a very sharing community. I know that you were a music teacher before you started doing blurbs. And you were in the education industry. And so what kind of made you decide that you wanted to do blurbs?
All right, I'm going to be really honest. It was laziness, which is probably a super weird answer, but I've got to be honest. I would love to say that I saw like a gap in the market and authors really needed help with this. I was clueless. Before COVID, I was working as a music teacher at a high school, and I knew that I wanted to do more writing. So I had been a freelance music journalist for a while. I used to write album reviews, which interestingly had a very similar word limit to your average blurbs. I've always been a bit of a short form writer, sort of like essays, music, but I had one less day of work at the school that I was at a week. So I had Wednesdays off. I was like, great, Wednesdays, I'm going to write, and I would like to get paid to write. So let's find out how I can do this. So I went on Fiverr.com, and my now husband he's published a bunch of books in the Latin language. I'd watched him go through the process and I saw that the blurb was part of it. And my thinking was, it's a short project. It's a short thing to write. I like writing short form. I looked around, the blurbs in different genres and things like that. And I've always been a blurb reader as well. I thought, okay, I wonder if people would pay me. And I genuinely thought that authors would just tell me to sod off. Like, I genuinely thought they'd be like, I've written a whole book. I don't need you to write 3 paragraphs to put on the back cover. Who do you think you are? Like, but I went on Fiverr and I was like, all right, $20, I'll write your book blurb for you. And I think it sat there for maybe 3 months and nothing happened. And then this one guy commissioned me to write his book blurb. And hilariously, I don't think he actually used it. He still gave me a 5-star review and was super happy. But I went and looked at his listing like later and it still just had the old blurb. But from there, like, things started to pick up a bit, all of a sudden I got a contact from Fiverr actually emailed me and said, well, we've selected you as a really high quality gig to promote on our site. And then I was on the top of, like, even after that 6 months, I was on the top of Fiverr for just months on end. I had to write more blurbs than I knew what to do with. I did it for a full year, but it was the equivalent of writing one blurb every day for 7 months straight. Like, that was the volume of blurbs that I did in literally every genre. I eventually left Fiverr and started Book Blurb Magic, and yeah, now I'm here.
That is an amazing journey. And so I want to ask you the first question I always get asked when I tell people that I'm writing my blurb. What's the difference between your query blurb and your back of the book blurb? Is it the same thing? Is there a difference?
That is such a great question. I've never written a query letter. And I've also, from what I've gathered, I've sort of read about them and looked at various ones. There seems to be several different types. And it seems, to my eye anyway, to vary depending on who you're pitching and what your genre is and things like that. But I have worked with querying authors who've come to me and they've said, you don't need to know about my query letter, but I need a good blurb to put in the query letter. Can you help me? And the feedback from those few authors that I've worked with, I know one of them went on to start getting partial requests straight away. And I think she ended up getting a full last I heard. And the change was the blurbs. From my perspective, it's still going to be the same blurb. Like, the book blurb's job is to sell your story. So it doesn't really matter who you're selling it to, in a sense. It's still going to have the same elements. It's still going to be about the same length. It's still speaking to, people who are going to want to read it. You're just, you're getting a different group of people to trust in it and want to back it, basically. It's just that maybe the blurb is part of the query letter rather than the whole thing. Whereas on the back cover or on your online book description, the book blurb has to speak for everything. Like, that's all that they're reading, basically.
This episode, we're just worried about the blurb, and we will be talking more about the entire query letter and what to put in it as we're talking about agent research and things like that. That blurb is the biggest part, and that is the part that most people struggle with. The bulk of it is all the blurb because they, like you said, need to be sold the book. They need to feel like it's something, not just that it's in their wheelhouse, but it's something interesting and that you as a writer know how to write.
100%. I think probably the main thing to not confuse, there is a distinct difference between a synopsis and a blurb. So synopsis or a summary, like, those words are interchangeable. And a lot of the time on the internet, if you Google how to write a book blurb, they say, summarize your book, like, tantalizingly. And it's like, no. So if you are trying to summarize your entire book and then stop where the spoilers start, that's where the blurb gets really long, gets really unwieldy, gets really boring, has no momentum. If you're looking at your blurb right now and really hating it and just thinking it's long and clunky, you're probably trying to summarize. A blurb has its own narrative arc that's a little bit different to your book. We're going up to the inciting incident so we can understand why we're reading this book at a particular time, and then that's kind of it. So we have to get them excited for the trajectory that happens after the inciting incident. We're not actually getting them excited for the spoilers. So a synopsis or a summary has all the spoilers in it.
Most agents want the tease. They want to know why I should read your first 5 pages. And then if that intrigues them, then they will ask you for more.
Yeah, exactly. Well, so people trying to summarize and then stop summarizing just before the spoilers start, that gives us a very frustrating blurb. It's frustrating for you as the author because it also usually means it has too much information in it as well. That's where things can get really unwieldy. So steer clear. If anyone tells you to summarize your book for the blurb, give them my website. I think, you've spent all this time on a huge piece of writing. You kind of, like, it's all in your head and you're trying to get it all onto the back cover because it all feels important. And it's about being able to kind of dissect what is or isn't important, which is, the simple but not easy part.
I tell people that all the time, that the story gets clouded in your head and you've got to uncloud that story.
I have found, so I wrote a novel and then I wrote the blurb for the novel. And I had the hardest time writing that blurb because I've written like 80,000 words for that novel. And then you have to just write a 150 word blurb. And then for my next novel, I actually wrote my blurb first before I actually wrote the novel. Because my novels play like a movie in my head. And so I kind of know how it starts, I know what the middle part is, and I know how it ends. I actually have found that my blurbs are much better because I wrote them first and then I did the story.
If you're a plotter and you've plotted out your story, write that blurb before you write the story, because you have just the basics. You know who your character is. Me as a
Yeah.
pantser, sometimes I get around chapter 10 before I really know what's going on.
Yeah, of
But I will
course.
stop and write that blurb because I don't want all that clouding in my head.
That's a fantastic idea. And I have worked with clients who they've finished their manuscript and we're in the blurb writing process and they suddenly realize they don't have an inciting incident, they don't have a catalyst, or they don't have a strong enough one, or the stakes aren't actually clear. And it's like, it doesn't happen super often. It's often with newer authors, and it can be a bit of a nasty shock if you get to this point and go, I don't have that piece of the puzzle actually. Whoops. So that by writing the blurb that early on, you're actually giving yourself that roadmap and making sure that you do have that catalyst and that stakes are clear enough as well, so you can write to that. I would say always revisit the blurb once your manuscript is done, in case there's been any nuance, in case there's any shift. Like, you'll almost always have to make some tweaks, but I think that's a fantastic idea. And interestingly, that's kind of your answer to the problem that I get around by working from a synopsis. So I don't read the full manuscript of the books that I'm given to blurb. That's like the first question most people ask me when I say I'm a blurb writer. They go, do you read all those books? I'm like, well, no, I couldn't, even if I wanted to. I wouldn't have the time. Working from a synopsis then allows me to kind of dive straight into the story, and then I will often recommend that authors attach their manuscript in whatever state it's in so that I can quickly look at things like tone, for example. And sometimes if there are questions I need answers to. One of the reasons I created my course, I was like, authors can absolutely write their own blurbs and you can have all the advantages of having that really deep knowledge of your book, but it is initially a disadvantage because there's so much up here. You've got to try and separate it out into the bits that are useful for a blurbs.
I do find it very ironic though, because I do not read blurbs. I'm a cover person. I really do not know what is in the book. I don't know who the characters are. I don't know what the story is.
That's interesting. Are you a blurb reader, Sarah?
I am a blurb reader.
Even if you're not a blurb reader, and even if you don't think your readers are particularly blurb readers, Amazon and things like that, we know that Amazon searches the blurb as well as your keywords and your categories and your metadata and goodness knows what else they make you put in there when you publish, right? Part of the reason it was given to you in the first place is the search terms, right?
Very true.
The blurb is still your keywords. It's still
Absolutely.
helping readers get to your book, because I do, a little part of me like dies inside when someone's like, I never read blurbs, but I'm like, they're still important.
They're the bane of my existence, but they're still important.
I think we're seeing, particularly in romance, a lot of trope readers and people who are buying books based on quotes and tropes rather than a traditional blurb, especially off social media, right? They'll buy from a reel that has a quote, or people do those carousels, like, you know, there's lovely graphics saying these are all the tropes inside my book. That's the kind of thing that, you know, a certain bunch of people will buy. But definitely anything that's more plotty is going to probably have more blurb readers, unless you just get those real diehard fans who are like, I'll read everything. Well, so this is an interesting thing, is that sometimes, because as authors, we know we're writing the book for a particular climax, right? Which is the spoilers. When we go to write the blurb, it can be really hard not to still be thinking that way. So what happens sometimes is you get blurbs with really bad pacing. Often they'll let slip spoilers. They get too specific. And then what happens is, because the reader expectation is that a blurb will tell them the inciting incident, they'll then be shocked that that hasn't happened until like the end of your book. A client actually like DM'd me a while back with quite a well-known author's book, but she normally really enjoy their books. This one really left me cold because I was expecting something completely different from the blurb, and the blurb actually had a key piece of information in it about the ending. And so for example, if, you know, the climax of your book is two characters, let's say third act breakup, right? But you mention that breakup in the blurb, that then sounds like a first act breakup to the reader. And so then they think the story is first act breakup and the rest of the story is them mending things. So they spend the whole book. This is kind of the cool thing about blurbs, is it actually impacts the reader's experience of the book, because they have these expectations set up. Help the reader to understand why the inciting incident is important. Giving the reader enough information to understand why the inciting incident is impacting and the extent to which it's impacting the main character. And then giving them a hint of, okay, how are they going to solve this? What's the next step? What do they need to do? What's in their way? And then the rest is just, you just leave it out. Authors give me huge long synopses for their books, and I read all through the entire thing, and I need to know this much so that I get the tone right and I don't make it sound like it's, I don't know, a murder mystery when actually it's a cozy mystery or whatever.
Or you don't want to misrepresent something with a certain type of wording that the end shows it's something else.
100%. Inciting incident is the star of the show, and you don't have to worry about much else, which should hopefully make you feel relieved.
Well, can I just say it's quite a talent of yours, because when authors write summaries of their novels, it is very plot driven, whereas blurbs are very character driven. And so for you to read this summary or the synopsis of the novel and then for you to actually put character into it, I'm like, that's quite impressive.
Thank you. I want your word vomit synopsis of like we're sitting down to have a cup of tea and you're like, okay, there's this character and then she tries to do this and this happens and blah, blah, blah. Because when authors write like that, they kind of unknowingly reveal the important things about it, but she doesn't want to say this. Like these throwaway comments start to actually give me an image of the character. And I should say, I don't always get it right first time. We work through multiple revisions. They're usually not huge, but it's usually the nuance, right? So I might use an adjective, but at the end of the day, for me, it's always a collaborative thing with the author as well. I'm like, so all of the key information obviously is going to be correct, but sometimes that nuance just needs to be massaged a little bit with the author's like deep knowledge of that character. I really enjoy that. That's the creative part, I guess, for me.
Well, I love the way that you're talking about the character and loving the character, because when I wrote my first query, it took me probably 50 iterations to find something that was sort of working, but I wasn't getting any requests or anything still. And then I made a change. I got requests, full requests, partial, everything had to do with character. And so I wrote at the top of the page for every other blurb I would ever write, I said, make me love your character so I care about what you say happens and want to read the pages.
Like I always sort of say, if you put Star Wars and Harry Potter down beat for beat, it's the same plot. It's the same old man mentor. There's the same young kid chosen one. There's the same, like if you just did plot, they are two very different fandoms. They are two very different spaces, right? Like no one would be like, oh yeah, they're exactly the same. But if you just tried to sell those on plot alone, no one would care. But we want to spend time with your characters. It's hard to find a completely new story. There's nothing new under the sun, right? So in a sense, your story is going to have been done before, but not the way that you're doing it. Not with your characters, not with your nuance and influence. So that is absolutely, that's a fantastic point, because that's the other thing I think is that we get very wrapped up in plot. Like, okay, I need to make sure they understand this backstory and they understand the world. We actually really want to understand your characters. And the cruel thing is, a blurb is not a very big amount of time to get to do that. In fact, it's incredibly difficult to get your audience to care about your characters in that amount of time. I always say people don't care about your characters yet, and it's kind of brutal, but they just don't care. So it's particularly in romance, it can be very easy to just focus on the emotional stakes and like, oh, she's heartbroken, he's really devastated. That we also need like a little bit of a concrete thing in there. So this is where the plot kind of helps bolster that emotional character driven kind of side of things. So Jenny is completely heartbroken, and also he's moved in next door. Even if we don't particularly care about Jenny, we can see how cringe it is that the guy who broke her heart has moved next door, right? We're like, oh god, that'd be awful if that happened to me. So it's getting that balance right, but it is definitely more character than plot. You need both of them, but it's characters that trump plot a lot of the time, because they're what make the book's different.
Okay, so I have two questions for you, mostly for my own interests, so I don't really care what anybody else thinks. I got your book blurb a kit for myself, because I was just like,
amazing
to get that, because that is the best thing ever. So if you want some help with your blurb, you should definitely go to Jessie's website, Book Blurb Magic. Go on there and go get yourself the free book blurb kit that Jessie has. But also, you say that blurbs should be written in the present tense. I'm going to combine these two questions though. Okay, wait, there's three questions. Okay, the second one is, if your novel is written in third person, should your blurb be in first person then, or should it be in third person? And then, if your novel is in dual POV, does your blurb need to be dual POV, or can it be from one character's perspective?
Awesome questions. Okay, so yes, always write in present tense. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what your manuscript is. We're not interested in jumping into a story that sounds like it's already happened. So as an experiment, you can try writing your blurb in past tense and just see how kind of flat it feels. The only exception, like where I use past tense, is memoir authors. You know that they're writing it, I don't know, age 50 or whatever, right? So we know that their life thus far has happened. We don't have to pretend it's happening now. So often what will happen is the first paragraph or so will be past tense because we're talking about their childhood. Then we move into present tense as we get to the bulk of what their memoir is covering. Now, if the whole memoir is about their childhood, it's a little bit different. But generally, memoir is moving through like childhood and then through like maybe some big life lessons they had in their 20s and through to present life or whatever. But often we'll actually start a memoir blurb in past tense and move through into present tense. That is the only exception that I have ever come across that I think works. The rest of the time, present tense. So, the first part of your question there was, if you're in third person, do we need to match the manuscript, right? Or can you have a first person blurb for a third person manuscript? Right. The thing to understand is third person blurbs have been the gold standard since forever, and they're still the gold standard for trad publishing. We're seeing some first person blurbs make their way into like romance, YA. I think someone told me they saw one in sci-fi. I saw one in crime, but they're pretty rare. Generally speaking, trad industry sticks to third person, and there's a really good reason for that. It's much harder to screw up. First person blurbs can sound really, really cringe really, really quickly, and third person blurbs always come across more professional, but also you can get plot across easier, you can get character across easier because you don't have to try to make it sound like something your character would say. It's just, you have that step back, right? So I would say if you're thinking about, querying the trad world, to stick with third person. A, because it is just an easier blurb to write all round, and B, because that's most likely what they're going to be used to seeing. You would have to write some real cracking, cutting-edge first-person blurb, I think. No matter what POV your book is in, there is no expectation that the blurb has to match the manuscript, that a third-person blurb means a third-person book. The caveat to that is that I'm seeing, anecdotally, TikTok, that some particularly romance readers who seem to be particularly hungry for first-person books at the moment are making a few assumptions like, oh, I won't read a book if it has a third person blurb because I assume the book's in third person, which is kind of wild to me because it's never been that way. Third person blurb is just, you open the book if you want to see what the POV is. But look, things change. So if you are a romance author and you think that your readers are looking for a first person book and you have written a first person book, maybe you're in your interests to write a first person blurb.
And it's very important to remember that even if you are traditionally querying, what you query with the agent is not what's going to be on the book blurb.
Yes, I have spoken to authors who have said the blurb that was in the query letter is the blurb that ended up on the back of the book. If you do a great job of it, they might just go, yeah, this is how we want to market your book. Fabulous. But you're absolutely right. They could make a different call and go, we'll go in a different direction. As a self-publishing author, it is a decision you have to make. So next part of your question was, dual POV manuscript. Doesn't have to be a dual POV blurb. The important thing to ask yourself before you write a blurb is, how much will I annoy people if my blurb doesn't match the manuscript? How annoyed are they going to be, right? So if you write a first person blurb and your book is in third person, you're going to make some people mad. You're going to make them really mad. They're like, I was here for a first person book because you wrote a first person blurb, and that's not standard. So you don't have to write a dual first person blurb for a dual first person book. You could choose to write third person, which is, I think, really nice because you can write one paragraph about one character, one paragraph about the other character, and a paragraph that brings them together. And you get their names in there, which is nice. This is something we lose with first-person blurbs. In dual first-person blurbs, we hear the names from the other person. That's kind of something that can be quite tricky. And then it can get trickier still in terms of if you have sapphic romance with same gender, can get very confusing with dual POV if you don't have the names in there because you've got she and whatever else. So it can be a bit of a minefield. And I will say, I think dual POV blurbs are a little bit going out of fashion. Nothing to panic about if you have one and if you've done a good job. But if it's not working for you, it can be worth writing a single POV blurb from whichever character you think has the stronger voice, because let's be honest, whenever we write dual, there's always a stronger character. And then I put a little end note at the bottom saying this is a dual POV.
And I really, really want my fantasy sci-fi listeners to stop whatever you are thinking right now and listen to that. There is always a stronger voice. I write fantasies with 5, 6, 7 POVs. I can really look at who is driving that novel, whose voice is the strongest, and that's always going to make the strongest blurb for me.
Yes.
Because they are the voice of the story.
That is, so brilliant. And fantasy authors in particular, as you say, are usually dealing with a lot of POVs. By and large, I would recommend having no more than 3 per blurb. Like, that's the best way to do it. But what's interesting is, like, I looked at a blurb just the other day where 3 POVs in the book, but the blurb was written third person, but through the eyes of the main character. The other two, even though they got pretty equal page time, was still secondary to like the chosen one, right? And those two only got a cursory mention at the end of the blurb, right? We kind of almost like, we didn't name check them, we just described them, right? So the author was saying to me, like, am I misleading my readers? Because actually it's a 3 POV book. And again, I come back to that, like, how much are we going to annoy people when they find out that there's extra POVs? Not very much, because we know what's happening in the most important one, and those other POVs are actually supporting and serving that main POV. Not all important characters in the book are important to the blurb. You've got to look at who the plot is really revolving around. Who has the central thread that holds everything together, is the reason that all of these characters meet or are on the same path or whatever it is.
I know you've talked about taglines versus hooks. What are they, and what should we do with them?
Yeah. Hooks are like my least favorite part of writing the blurb. They're the most satisfying to get, but they're the ones where I like pace up and down and I go on a walk and I question my life choices. I don't have a magic tip that I can give you that suddenly makes hook writing easy, but I can make it easier. So essentially, the hook is the headline of your blurb. The tagline I see as something separate in my mind, and when I teach my students, a tagline is like a shorter hooky sentence on the front cover of the book. So for like a murder mystery, you might have murder is only a minute away, like just something kind of a little bit general, speaks to the genre, that kind of thing, right? And then the hook for that one on the back cover, it's the headline of your blurb. It's often like on Amazon, I recommend you like bold it. Your cover designer might make it a slightly bigger, different font. Its job is to, it's like good clickbait, right? Like, it's not disappointing clickbait. It makes you want to go, yep, I need to know more. I need to read the next sentence. And then the rest of the blurb should deliver on that. So for that same book example that I gave, you know, your hook example might be, I didn't know how easy it was to kill a man until I'd already done it. So that instantly takes us into the character's voice, gets us like, whoa, what the heck? Like, this character killed someone already. The book hasn't started. What's going on? We need to find out more. So that it's got a bit more detail. If my hook was just murder is only a minute away, I mean, that's not terrible. It's quite sort of snappy. It's not enough detail for us to necessarily need to read the next sentence and be really excited to read the next sentence. So I will say I'm seeing less and less hooks on trad published books. Like, you used to see them on pretty much every book, and now there's a lot less. And I think that's to your advantage if you are querying and you've got a great hook headline you can put in there, or if you're a self-publishing author, you're going to stand out. A lot of the time, trad publishers are using that space at the top of the blurb to say things like the TikTok sensation or the must read of the summer and this general kind of stuff, which it's really hard to know whether that's working for them or not, because they have the money to pump into different channels of marketing. I don't necessarily advocate following what the trad publishers do. It's interesting to keep an eye on and just kind of see what's out there. But I will say, hook writing, I usually, write the blurb first, and then I sit there and I think about the central themes of the story, and I play around with quotes and like plays on words and contrast, and eventually something floats into view. Sometimes a quote from the manuscript can make a great hook. Like, that's an easy out. I like to just stare into space until inspiration hits.
Sounds familiar.
Inescapable part of writing, I fear.
I am excited to hear all of the fantastic feedback from people on everything that you're teaching them. Thank you so much for joining us and taking time out of your day. We appreciate it so much.
My pleasure.
Let's get your fingers back on the keyboards and your pens back on the paper.
And if you like what we're doing here and you want to see more and learn more and just support us, please go follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Threads at Gentiles Podcast, and on TikTok and Twitter/X at Podcast Details. And please go follow JC at Book Blurbs Magic.
Happy writing.
Bye.